Hello, I'm Christine Haynes, sewing teacher, author, and pattern maker. And today I'm going to teach you some tips and tricks for sewing the Departure Shift dress. I look forward to sewing with you. So the Departure Shift dress is a classic shift dress. I designed this pattern exclusively for Sew News magazine, and I wanted to keep it really true to the original idea of a shift dress. So I kept really clean, simple lines. It has bust darts here at the front. We have a really nice, simple set-in sleeve. The neckline is finished with bias binding. We have inseam pockets, which everyone loves. And in the back, closing everything up, we have an invisible zipper up the back. The great thing about a shift dress is that it shows off a print wonderfully. It's a really nice blank canvas because there aren't any seams in the front, nothing to break up your print. So it's a really good opportunity to use something bold like both of these choices I've used here. These fabrics that I'm using here and that are on set are all supplied by Cotton and Steel. So they make really beautiful fabrics in a variety of substrates. I'm using, for the one I'm wearing, is a rayon. And for the rayon, I actually omitted the side seam pockets because it can get kind of bulky. This fabric is meant to be loose and drapey. This is a quilt weight cotton, and so the pocket actually holds its shape really well because it creates much more of an A-line shape with this weight of fabric. You can use really kind of a wide range of fabrics for this shape. You can use something a little heavier. It's just going to stand out a little more stiff as you progress in weight. And you can go down to something as light as a silk or a rayon. The only thing I would say is that neck binding, if you do choose to go something a little heavier, you might want to choose a lighter fabric just for that part. Otherwise, it might get really bulky. We're going to focus on two of the main things that make this dress a little more beyond a beginner, which is the invisible zipper and the set-in sleeve. So let's get started. Here I have my dress sample. I have already sewn the bust darts. And just a couple of pointers about bust darts. You always want to sew from the raw edge of the fabric towards the apex. I like to place my pins right in my stitch line with the heads of the pins facing the apex so I can pull them out towards me as I'm working. On every dart, I want to use at least 3 pins because the first pin needs to be pulled out pretty much the minute you start sewing, and you want to have at least 2 more pins along this long stretch. And at the apex, I like to turn my stitch length down to 1.0 and not backstitch or anything, just a nice tight stitch so it doesn't come undone. And then of course, press it down. The pattern instructions for whatever pattern you're using will always tell you which direction to press, but bust darts traditionally are pressed down away from your shoulders. I've already sewn my shoulder seams and my side seams. Before we put in the invisible zipper, you'd want those sewn and finished. And now we're going to focus on the zipper. I love invisible zippers because it's a really nice, clean, and professional finish. There's no exposed top stitching, which is something that is hard to master. I find in my beginner level students, they have a hard time getting all of that top stitching done really perfectly with a regular zipper. But everyone, for the most part, gets an invisible zipper in perfectly. So at the center back seam, before we put our zipper in, we always need to finish the seam allowance because we can't do that after the fact. I also, as you see here, have interfacing pressed to this part here. I like to have a little bit of strength for the seam where the zipper is going to be. So I like to have interfacing right at that point. So I want to use a lightweight woven fusible interfacing, which I have right here. So there's a bunch of descriptions there. Lightweight, woven, fusible. Lightweight means it's not too heavy. Woven means this is actually cotton fabric, and fusible means it's got glue on the opposite side. So that glue is going to melt onto my fabric as I hit it with an iron. So on this side, I've already interfaced it, and I'm going to interface and finish the seam on the other side before we put our zipper in. So Now, if you're using a fabric that's really lightweight, you might want to use an even lighter interfacing. And if you're using something heavy in fabric, you may not need to interface it at all. But if I'm using anything like a quilt weight or this rayon, I always like to strengthen the seam. It keeps the seam from getting puckered while you sew the zipper in. And it also just strengthens it because I'm using, you're going up and down with your zipper all the time. So I'm just pressing that in place. This piece that I'm using is 22 inches long because that's the length of the zipper that we're using, and it's 1 inch wide because we're going to have a 5/8 seam allowance. I want to be stitching through that interfacing. So we're going to take this now that we've put our interfacing on there, we're going to take it over to the machine and we're going to just finish this raw edge. Now there's a lot of ways that you can finish the raw edge of your fabric. If you have an overlock or a serger machine, you can totally use that at this moment. But there's one really important thing, which is that I wouldn't want to cut any of the fabric away at this point. So be sure if you are using something like an overlock machine that you're not cutting the fabric away. So you might want to disengage the knife. I'm going to be using a 3-step zigzag, which most machines have. If you don't own an overlock machine, it's a really nice way to finish the fabric. I'm using a 1/8 seam allowance. And essentially what's happening is the 3rd stitch is going off to the right so that it's wrapping the thread all the way around the fabric. And you're just going to go all the way down to the bottom. You never need to backstitch with a zigzag, so you don't have to do that. So here you can see the 3-step zigzag. I'll show it to you on this side because it's a little bit easier to see. So that 3rd stitch is basically going right to the edge of the fabric so that it's not going to unravel and it's going to just give it a nice finish. You can use a regular zigzag, or like I said, you could use your overlock or pinking shears too. All right, now that our seam is ready to put the zipper in it, we have to do one thing to the zipper. So let's talk about the zipper first. This is an invisible zipper. So that's a little bit different than a regular zipper. So when you zip this up, looking at the zipper, the right side of the zipper is the side that has no teeth but a pull showing. The wrong side of the zipper is where you see the teeth. Now this is really important because we're always putting right sides together. If you don't know what side of the zipper is actually the right side of the zipper, then you might actually end up twisting it in the end. So we know that when we put the right side of our zipper up against the right side of the fabric, this is the side of the zipper we want face down on the right side of our fabric. Invisible zippers have all of their coils on the back side, and they're curled down like the letter C, and we actually want them to be standing much more straight up like the letter L, so a right angle with the zipper tape itself. So we're going to give that a little bit of a press. It's important to note that this is not a metal zipper, this is a plastic zipper, so you don't want to linger with your hot iron. So I'm just quickly pushing the teeth away from the tape and giving it a press. I'm not lingering and pressing it flat. I'm just going over it quick enough so that this now stands straight up at a right angle with the tape. You can see the difference right here. So here it is pressed up, and here it's still curled down. So I want to just take a minute and press that up. If you don't do that and you use it with the teeth coiled still towards the tape, you're not going to be able to get your stitch close enough to the zipper teeth, and you're always going to see a little bit of tape in the end. Also, if you overpress and you press it too flat, you might actually get your stitch a little too close to the teeth, and your zipper won't go up and down very easily. So we want it to just stand straight up, like the letter L. All right, once that guy is pressed, he's ready to go in our dress. So we want to turn our dress around so it's right sides out, because again, we're going to put right sides together. So here's my center back seam. So I'm putting the right side of my zipper, which is the side with the pull, on the right side of the dress. Now that means like fabric speaking, not left to right, meaning right side of the fabric. So I'm actually going to start on the left seam, side of the seam. So I'm going to be putting this left side of the tape right side down on the left side of the dress. I want to line up the top. So with this pattern, I want the top edge flush with my fabric. I'm going to use my seam gauge and make sure that the teeth are 5/8 from the edge of the fabric. So it should be in place right there. That very top stopper of the zipper should be 5/8 from the top. Most zippers have that placement already built in, but it's a good thing to double check. I'm putting that flush with the top knowing that that is 5/8, but it's always a good thing to just double check. So I'm pinned in place there, and that's actually the only pin I'm going to put in it. And we're going to take this over to our machine. Now, the best foot for installing an invisible zipper is an invisible zipper foot. But I have found that a lot of people actually don't have an invisible zipper foot. It never comes with your machine automatically. The machine comes with a regular zipper foot. So we've decided to show you how to use a regular zipper foot to make this happen, since that's actually what most people have at home. If you decide to get a regular zipper foot or an invisible zipper foot, they are really handy, but they really just serve that one purpose. So the key is that I'm opening up the needle area as much as I can. It's because I want to get as close as I can to my actual teeth over here, I'm pushing the needle as far left as I can make it. So this machine has a button that pushes the needle automatically as far left as it will go. A lot of machines don't have that, so you may have to adjust the width to manually push the needle as far left as it can go, so that you can get it as close as you can to the teeth itself. So we have adjusted our seam allowance because I'm moving the needle from center, which means I can't actually follow my 5/8 seam allowance. So you would want to take into account how far over you've moved your needle. This machine, I've moved it over 1/8 of an inch. So instead of using the 5/8, I'm going to use the 4/8 or the 1/2 inch. I'm going to sink in my needle right there and lower the foot in place. And you can see I'm right up against the actual teeth. With my needle down in, I can take out that first pin with no danger of getting out of place. I want to just stay right in line with my seam allowance. I'm going to backstitch at the beginning. And I'm going to just sew all the way down. Now, I'm not pinning this, but if there's nothing wrong with you pinning it. So if you're feeling unstable with this part, it's totally okay. Just make sure the heads of the pins are facing you as you're sewing. Now, if you have an invisible zipper foot, you would be using the left side of the channel because it has 2 channels on the underside of the foot. And the left side of the channel would put the needle placement exactly where I am right now. So So I'm going to go as far down as I can. And of course, backstitch when you get to the stopper. So you can see my stitch is right up against my teeth. This is, of course, now all going to get flipped to the seam allowance. So when this is all done, all we have is the teeth on the right side. So we're going to go back to our table and get this ready to sew the other side. This part I find is where people get a little bit turned around, because if we look here at our zipper, we now want the right side of the other part of the zipper, the other side of the zipper facing the right side of the fabric on the other side of the seam. So what happens is I'm just going to flip it once and then flip it a second time so that the right side of the zipper is face down on the opposite side of the seam. Again, I'm keeping it flush with the top, and I'm keeping it 5/8 from my side seam, or my seam edge. I'm again just going to pin at the top, but again, it's totally okay to pin all the way down if you're feeling like that will help keep everything in place. And we're going to take it and do exactly what we just did with the zipper foot on the other side. So one big difference here is that if you look at where everything was positioned for the last side, obviously I can't use it the way it's in position right now because I need my needle and everything to be on the other side. So if you have a foot like this, you're going to just swap sides and now move my needle as far to the right as it will go. This machine also has seam allowance markings on the left of the foot. Some machines have that, some don't. If yours does not, then be sure to mark it with like a piece of painter's tape or washi tape or something so that you know where you're supposed to be in position when you're sewing it. Again, I've sunk my needle, I'm in place, and I'm going to do my back stitch. And I'm going to stay on that seam allowance, and I'm going to sew all the way down. This can be a little bit awkward because we're sewing on the opposite side than what we're used to, and we have all this extra fabric that's now going to get shoved into this little cave. And the number one question I get at this point when I'm demonstrating this with students is, why don't I just sew up from bottom to top? Well, the reason we're not going to sew that way is because it's really better for the zipper and for the lay of the fabric to sew both sides in the same direction. If the fabric were to shift, or if anything were to get out of place, they would shift in unison, both going down towards the bottom of the zipper versus one going up and one going down. Because it's attached at the bottom here, you can see it starts to get a little bit bunchy. Just do your best to manage your fabric and to stay on your seam allowance and to stay as close to the teeth as you can. It's not as scary as you might seem. Also, you can always practice this on scrap. Actually, I highly recommend that. If you've never done one before, reduce your level of stress and try it on a scrap first. Same as the other side, I'm going to get to the bottom and I'm going to go as close as I can to my teeth and the bottom stop, and we're good. So both sides are now sewn exactly the same way there. You can see with that contrast stitching, you would obviously want to use matching stitching when you're doing this, that it's just nice and close right up to the teeth, as close as we can. I'm going to take this back over to our table. And that bottom pull needs to be flipped inside the dress if it isn't already, and that just zips straight up the back. And there it is up the center back. So you can see, actually, I can see a little bit of my zipper tape here, which means I just didn't get quite close enough to my teeth as you would ideally like to be. That's not all bad. You can always go back and actually get a little bit closer, move your needle over a little bit further. But it's good to see actually what would be ideal and what would be less than ideal. So right here, I really don't want to see any of this zipper tape. So if you find that and you can't get quite close enough, that might be a moment to invest in an invisible zipper foot. Maybe your machine just isn't quite adequately getting over with a regular zipper foot. But we also have to finish up the bottom. Can't leave it unsewn. So I'm not actually going to sew this part, but I'm going to talk you through what you would be doing. All we would do is line up our seam just like you normally would and give it some good pins through here. And the key part you would really want to pin carefully is this bottom. This little tail needs to be out of the way. This needs to be folded up, and I highly suggest putting a pin right there and right there, keeping this tail out of the way because you want to start your stitch as close to that one as you can to just complete the rest of the seam. So this part can be a little bit fussy, but it's just as anything, practice makes perfect. So give it a shot, and most people don't see those mistakes that you see. All right, let's talk a little bit about the other main thing, which is the set-in sleeve. So I've already sewn the side seam here on the sleeve itself. We want to put some base stitches here in the sleeve cap so that we can ease it into the sleeve armhole opening itself. So we're going to go over to the machine and do that real quick. Base stitch, as we've learned before, is a regular stitch just at a slightly longer length, which is like a 4.0 length. You never want to back stitch on a based stitch. And we've been moving our needle around, so it's a good moment to just make sure you're back in position. There are notches on the sleeve. So you can see we have a single notch, another single notch, and a double notch. The one in the middle is for the shoulder seam, so we want to do base stitches from the single to the double, and we're going to do it above and below our stitch line. So we're going to do that at 3/8 and 6/8. That's the first one. We'll go back in and we'll do the other one at 6/8, which is the same as the 20 line if you're using a machine that has metric markings on it. So we've got our base stitches across the sleeve cap, and we're going to ease that to fit the arm side of the dress itself. So easing is something that takes some finesse, and I know all sewers, whether you've been sewing a really long time or you've just started, it's something you do sort of holding your breath, hoping it goes well, and trying not to form any puckers along the way. Essentially what's happening is that I need to reduce this cap to accommodate for my shoulder. So we want to line up our notches, make sure we're putting the right sleeve into the right side and the left sleeve into the left side, and I'm sliding it into the dress right sides together. You are going to pin at those key anchor points, that upper notch, the single notch, and the double notch, and of course that underarm seam. Once you get all of those anchor points in place, you can pin from the underarm seam to each anchor point because that part's not going to be eased. So I'm pinning inside the circle of the sleeve itself, not outside. You can see I'm pinning from the underarm seam up to that first notch, and I'm going to do the same on the other side. Now the rest of this needs to be reduced to accommodate your shoulder. So let's actually look at our sample here for a quick second. This here has no puckers. That's a set-in sleeve. Now if this had little puckers in it intentionally, that would be a gathered sleeve. Gathering is exactly what we're doing here, but we want to sew it without any puckers being formed. Why that curve is bigger is because we have to get over this little bump of our shoulder. So it needs to be a little bit bigger of a circle so that it can accommodate for our body's curves. I'm simply going to take these threads here on the side that's facing me, and I'm going to pull them. It's a little bit stuck. If you find it gets a little stuck, like maybe the machine bunched up a little bit, just make sure to release it so that you have something to grab. And I'm not gathering in that I want to over pull these and actually form little pinches. I'm just pulling it a little bit so that the outer part is reduced, and my main focus is my stitch line. It's actually right here that I'm really worried about. The outer ring is going to be bigger than the inner ring, right? So the outside of the seam is going to be kind of waffly looking, right, outside here. All I really care about is the stitch line, which is right between my two based stitches. You can also sort of curve this as you're working with it in the shape of your shoulder, because that's actually how it's going to be shaped. So it's helpful when pinning it to keep it that way. And I'm going to do the same on this side. Pull this thread facing me. And though you would always sew your dress with, traditionally, I should say, with matching thread, I almost always do my based stitching in a contrast because it's something you can see really clearly. It's also a great way to use up thread of another color that maybe you don't use as frequently. You've got a spool of hot pink lying around that you rarely use. So again, I'm just easing that all in and focusing on my stitch line. Once you're feeling good about it and it's evenly spread out, we're going to take it to the machine and stitch it. And this is going to just be a regular straight stitch, but it's a little awkward because it's going to be in the round. We're going to be stitching inside the sleeve here, and we're not going to want to form pinches even though it's going to look like it's pinched. So let's take it to our machine. Again, I was doing base stitching last, so be sure to go back to your regular stitch length. It's really easy to forget that. So I'm sliding this circle on to the foot, and it can be really awkward to do. But once we get in position, essentially what's happening is I'm checking the underside to keep it smooth. So I have my hand underneath on the left, my left hand, and I have everything nice and smooth on this side. And I'm going to make sure, actually, first that my seam allowance is pressed the way we want it on the underside. It felt a little bunchy. All right, so try to flatten that so you guys can see that. This is where I'm stitching. I definitely want to do my back stitch. And I want to stay right on my 5/8 seam allowance. Now don't fight the curve. So I'm constantly putting my hand underneath and smoothing, so I'm actually pulling the fabric to the left from the underside and keeping this curve on the right in place. And just slowly making my way around. Now the first part is easy because there's no easing at that part. So you literally ease into your easing. Once we get to the easing, this is a moment where I'm constantly sinking my needle to make sure that I'm not getting out of place, because I want to rotate my fabric towards me, but I don't want to get my needle out of place or my line's going to be jaggy. So I'm just smoothing the seam line. So I'm kind of parting the fabric to the right and left of the stitch line, making sure to not form any pinches as I go. And if you have to sink your needle and pick up your foot and smooth things out, that's all right. It's kind of a slow seam to sew because you want it to be just right. So again, sinking my needle, rotating everything towards me. Keeping that fabric nice and smooth as we go over it. Now, let's say you do form a pinch. You see one coming, you totally went over it. Most of my students, their inclination is to stop, pull everything out, and start over. Definitely, I suggest keep going because you've eased everything in, you've pinned it all in place. It's much, much easier to go back after the fact and take out just those like stitches along that 1 inch area where you formed a little pucker and just repair that one spot. There's no need to start all over again. Now I'm on my other straightaway where I have no easing. You can breathe a sigh of relief and meet up with your first back stitch and back stitch again. So here's what we're looking for. On the outer part of the sleeve itself, no puckers. I did get a little bit off here. This is not exactly an ideal line up here. You do want the raw edges of the fabric lined up. So if this were mine at home, I might go back and take out this part and make sure that the sleeve was a little more lined up at that point. And on the inside, I just have my base stitches, which I can then pull out. And then the sleeve area, we would finish the seam just as we normally would. So once you turn it right side out, you can see you've got your sleeve all in place. It's not as scary as it looks. So now you know more about putting in an invisible zipper, interfacing, setting a sleeve, and a little bit more about bust darts. I'm sure you'll love making the departure dress. I hope you enjoyed sewing with me. I really enjoyed sewing with you.